Tuning into the narratives in the American election. In this year of successive worldwide elections, the issues in the United States presidential election, to be held in November, have not yet aroused considerable scrutiny. Yet, 1892 was the last time an immediately former president was contesting with his successor incumbent. The election's main issues will cover immigration, democracy, foreign policy, abortion and Donald Trump's indictments. In the current deeply polarized setting, opinion polls show that supporters of the former Republican president, Donald Trump, will do so again, and the same applies to the current Democrat president, Joe Biden's followers. The economy, the perception. The economy has become an important issue in the November presidential elections. Normally, the economy should be decisive since history shows that a sitting president with a strong economy gets re-elected. But different economic indicators are traveling in different directions. Some are positive, with low unemployment and a rising stock market, but negatives also appear in the high interest rate which affects everyone using credit. The rate of inflation has not come down, nor have prices even after the COVID-19 pandemic, though incomes have gone up. The good aspects of the economy take time to impact the public, unlike the negatives. Mr. Biden is considered a better economic manager than Mr. Trump, and 65% of the electorate appears to think that the economy is in good or very good shape. But whether this will be a steady trend or only a momentary reaction cannot be anticipated, remembering that Mr. Trump's pre-pandemic economy was quite strong. Most voters are not focusing on the economy, at least for now. Polarization in American society covers social issues as well as the urban versus rural/semi-urban divide. The latter since the 1990s are Republican, the former Democrat, and the two are sharply divided. Deindustrialization, deregulation since the 1990s, job losses, and agribusiness suffering have affected the rural areas deeply and magnified these differences. President Biden has tried to rectify this but has not received any credit for his initiatives because the rural and semi-urban areas remain feeling discriminated against. Mr. Biden knows very well that the rural vote needs more attention, but it will take decades for such a divide to be properly rectified. In industry, employment levels are good but inequality is still grave. A great deal of current investment goes into high-tech, high-skilled, high-salaried jobs, but many of these projects are long-term in gestation. Republicans tend to avoid involvement in the economy, but, here too, Republican opinion seems to be changing. Mr. Trump has been talking of a 10% across-the-board tariff, but this will add to inflation and increase each family's expenditure by $1,500 to $2,500 every year. The approach is to trade. In trade policy, there are clear differences between the Biden and Trump approaches. Mr. Trump is no believer in multilateralism, and during his tenure used tariffs to leverage better bilateral trade deals. Mr. Biden retained some of these tariffs but lowered others for Europeans, for example, to block Chinese steel and aluminium in order to limit the high carbon used to make these in China. The age of neoliberal fundamentalist democratic policies seems to be over, while on the Republican side, the debate continues. The libertarians are very powerful but there are nascent signs of rebellion against them. Regarding their unions, in some regions blue-collar workers have become newly unionized at a time when the recent trend has seen the union movement decreasing. Unions have been helpful socially and assisted the Democrats, but with deindustrialization, their place in society has been taken over by evangelical movements and gun lobbies, which attract strong support among rural communities. Support for unions appears still high among the American public, and Mr. Biden was the first U.S. president ever to join a picket line, but this factor is not likely to help his campaign for a second term. Factors now present. 4 danger signals seem key to the future of American democracy: extreme partisan polarization, social questions of belonging, such as anti-immigration and racism, high economic inequality and executive aggrandizement, namely, when a leader expands his/her power beyond the customary checks and balances. Some experts feel that all 4 factors are now present in the United States. Mr. Trump was unwelcoming to immigrants, and by the end of his term, public support for immigration had risen. Mr. Trump's policies on immigration will prove inflationary since he wishes to deport thousands of low-wage earners. Mr. Biden is more welcoming, but perhaps more so than the American public at large wanted, and he mismanaged border issues. This is now a contentious issue even among Democrats and will be another factor going into the elections. Mr. Biden tried to outflank the Republicans with a bipartisan bill that the Democrats would not normally have agreed to, but Mr. Trump gave Mr. Biden a lifeline by opposing it. Mr. Biden will now lose fewer votes as a result. Opinion polls suggest that Democrat support among minorities such as African Americans, Latinos and Asian Americans is slipping. But all these polls have a small sample size and the shifts could be small, and more marked among men than women. Nevertheless, they give cause for the Democratic candidate in a few key states to be worried. In the Biden versus Trump face-off, the core issues to shape the November election exist but have still to stir up scrutiny.
ये तो एडिटोरियल है आपका हिंदू का 29 जून का. इसका हेडलाइंस था ट्यूनिंग इनटू द नैरेटिव्स इन द अमेरिकन इलेक्शन. ओके, अब हम देखते हैं केन्या से रिलेटेड एडिटोरियल आया है डेथ ट्रैप का. तो क्या है वो, उसको सुन लेते हैं.
Trap. Kenya must find ways to service its debt without punishing its people. The Kenyan president's decision to rush through parliament an IMF-backed finance bill that sought to increase taxes on everything from imported sanitary pads and tires to bread and fuel backfired, with protesters storming a section of the parliament on Tuesday. After the protests, which rights groups said had left at least 23 people killed and 200 injured, President William Ruto announced that he would not sign the bill. The Kenyan government could have avoided this bloody confrontation had it paid more attention to the public mood. The government's plan was to raise an extra 200 billion Kenyan shilling, some $1.55 billion, in taxes. Earlier this year, the country had reached a deal with the IMF to secure $941 million in additional lending. In subsequent talks in Nairobi, they agreed to reforms, including tax increases, to stabilize the country's debt-battered financial situation. The IMF deal triggered street protests. But the government still went ahead with the plan to impose additional taxes on the country of 54 million people, a third of whom still live in poverty. The government argues that its hands were tied as the country struggles to repay its huge debt burden. Domestic and foreign debt was a staggering $80 billion last year, accounting for nearly 3/4 of its GDP. The government spent more than half of its revenue servicing debts last year. The crisis is an indictment of the development model Kenya and several other countries in the continent follow. Kenya, one of the fastest growing countries in Africa, has borrowed heavily from multinational lenders such as the World Bank and the IMF as well as bilateral partners such as China, to finance its infrastructure projects. But growth tanked and expenses rocketed during the COVID-19 pandemic years. The Ukraine war has led to a spike in global food and energy prices, hitting African economies. When the advanced countries increased interest rates to fight inflation, the payment burden of debt-ridden countries ballooned. In Africa, Zambia and Ghana defaulted on their payments, and then reached agreements with their creditors to restructure debt. Mr. Ruto, who came to power in 2022, has promised to address the debt problem. But he has been unimaginative and conventional, letting the unpopular IMF dictate one-sided policy measures. Now that the bill has been withdrawn, he will have to tread carefully. He has yet to spell out his next measures, besides saying that austerity measures would be rolled out. He will have to strike a balance between his people's needs and Kenya's creditors. Multinational and bilateral lenders should help the debt-laden countries in Africa come out of this trap without punishing their poor populace.
Conspicuously. Conspicuously.
Conspicuously. Conspicuously.
कॉन्स्पिक्यूअसली मीन्स होता है प्रकट रूप से। अब देखते हैं इसको थोड़ा सा और। कॉन्स्पिक्यूअसली, CONSPICUOUSLY,
Conspicuously.
Conspicuously.
in a way that is conspicuous. Conspicuous means हो गया noticeable, 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 NOTICEABLE। अब जैसे कह सकते हैं कि द टेम्पल्स ग्रैंड वाइट आर्क्स rose conspicuously over the dirty decaying city. Miss Andrews was conspicuously absent from the event। मतलब प्रकट रूप से, स्पष्ट रूप से, नोटिसेबल आप उसको कह सकते हैं। कॉन्स्पिक्यूअसली कोई आपका विचार है जो आप रखते हैं किसी आगे, वो प्रकट हो जाता है कि आप क्या बैक में सोच रहे हैं, मतलब बैक एंड पे क्या सोच रहे हैं। जैसे पुलिस कार्स वर conspicuously parked inside and outside the ground. Okay, his grim reveals a conspicuously missing tooth। ठीक है। Escaping from prisons was one of his specialities, but this time he had conspicuously failed। आप कुछ एडिटर को लेटर लिखे हैं, उसको भी देख लेते हैं इन शॉर्ट में। मंगोलिया का थोड़ा देख लेते हैं, मंगोलिया के बारे में। वो ओपन नहीं हो रहा उसकी वॉइस, तो मंगोलिया देखते हैं। मंगोलिया goes to the polls to elect new parliament।
Mongolia goes to the polls to elect new parliament. Associated Press. Ulaanbaatar. Voters in the relatively young democracy of Mongolia were electing a new parliament on Friday in their landlocked country squeezed between China and Russia, two much larger authoritarian states. At stake were 126 seats in an expanded parliament, 50 more than in the previous election in 2020. That contest was won by the Mongolian People's Party in a landslide. The governing party still appears to hold the upper hand, but other parties may be able to capitalize on voter discontent to eat into its majority. About 24 voters lined up on a staircase heading down to a polling station in the outskirts of Ulaanbaatar early on Friday morning. Mongolia became a democracy in 1990, ending more than 6 decades of one-party communist rule. While people have welcomed the freedoms that came with the end of the communist system, many have grown cynical of the parliament and its members, seeing them as working mainly to enrich themselves and their business associates. The Mongolian People's Party has recognized those problems but largely blamed them on other political parties. The Prime Minister, Oyunertan Luvzanamsrai, said on Friday that democracy and trust in the parliament are weakened when personal interest is put ahead of the national interest. He called for a new page of cooperation between the government and citizens after the first 3 decades of democracy. Corruption scandals have eroded confidence in the government and political parties. Besides the centre-right Democratic Party, the Hun Party has emerged in this election as a potential third force. In addition to corruption, major issues for voters included unemployment and inflation in an economy rocked by the COVID-19 pandemic and then by the fallout from the war in Ukraine. There were 2,198 polling stations spread out across the sparsely populated country, which is large geographically but has a population of only 3.4 million people. The voting stations are to close at 10 p.m. with preliminary results expected early Saturday morning. Mongolia became a democracy in 1990, ending more than 6 decades of one-party communist rule.
एक वर्ड है
Apartheid.
अपाथाइड, APARTHEID, आर इसमें साइलेंट रहता है। अपाथाइड।
Apartheid.
Apartheid. Apartheid.
ये क्या है कि दक्षिण अफ्रीका की एक पुरानी सरकारी नीति है जिसके आधार पर श्वेत और अश्वेत व्यक्तियों को अलग रखा जाता था। ये रंगभेद की नीति कहलाती थी। अपाथाइड।
Apartheid.